Good morning and welcome to SentencingStats.com. I am Mark Allenbaugh, Chief Strategy Officer. Today's presentation will be about Paul Manafort and what sentence we think he might receive should he be convicted based on U.S. Sentencing Commission data. So first off, briefly, the superseding indictment here. Our analysis is going to pertain to his case in the Eastern District of Virginia. He also has one in the District of Columbia. So this one is focused solely on the Eastern District of Virginia and the superseding indictment. I will go quickly through the guidelines calculation. This is a rather sophisticated case. It's going to involve three groups of offenses, and I'll just summarize those quickly. He's alleged to commit various counts of bank fraud, obtaining loans illegally, tax fraud by underreporting his income, and a related offense to the tax fraud, F-bar violations, which essentially require people to check a box on their income return to indicate if they have a foreign bank account. So he's alleged to have violated those three types of offenses. What's really interesting, though, just right off the bat, is the fact that he's going to trial. Trials are rather rare in the criminal justice system vis-a-vis pleas. Most people plead out once they are indicted. And here we can see that according to the Commission's latest statistics, of all those sentenced last fiscal year 2017, for fraud offenses, there were 6,029. 93.6% of those were convicted by way of plea, and only 6.4% went to trial. So very few individuals go to trial. And of those that do go to trial, most of them end up being convicted. Now, this is a little bit dated, but this is the latest data available from the Department of Justice, from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And this shows back in 2014 that for, again, fraud offenses, there were quite a bit more fraud cases that year. But even so, only 367, actually a total of just over 400, went to trial, at least trial by jury. 90.8% of those resulted in a conviction, and only 9.2% were acquitted. So in other words, that year, there were 45 acquittals out of a total of 8,992 cases. That, of course, includes dismissals as well, but that's kind of a separate issue. The point being is that even going to trial, the few trials that are out there still result in 90% of the time, the overwhelming majority of the time, a conviction. So he is up against very significant odds if he thinks that going to trial may result in an acquittal. And I should mention that even if he's acquitted on some or most of the charges, as long as he's convicted of one of those charges, everything else comes back in at sentencing. Acquitted conduct can be considered at sentencing, according to the U.S. Supreme Court from a 1997 decision, United States versus Watts. So let's look at the penalty, the total penalty that he's looked at. As has been widely reported, he's looking at 305 years. Almost nobody ever gets the statutory maximum penalty. So what will largely determine his sentence, or at least create the ballpark for a sentence and from which the judge can pick or will be influenced by, is the sentencing guidelines. And the federal sentencing guidelines for white-collar cases or fraud cases, be it general fraud or tax fraud or what have you, are largely driven by the loss amounts. So I'm going to go through this quickly. These are really technical issues. I have a longer version of this presentation available also online where I go through the specifics. But based on the superseding indictment, I calculate his bank fraud loss to be about almost $26 million, and the unreported income that has to do with the tax fraud portion to be over $31 million in unreported income, which under the guidelines equates to a tax loss of nearly $9 million. So using those two amounts there, we now look at the three groups of offenses as I discussed earlier, and I'll take these in order. So the bank fraud, the way I calculate that based upon the $26 million in loss, he is going to get a plus 22 here, which ends up at a total of 39. I'm giving him a leadership role because he's charged with conspiracy, and I'm also giving him obstruction of justice. I'm pretty sure that the PSR or the probation office will give him obstruction of justice. This stems from his alleged witness tampering that resulted in his bail being revoked. So he's looking at a 39 right there. Of course, he's not going to get acceptance of responsibility since he has been convicted by trial. So then the second group, the FBAR violations, here I calculate that his final offense level there, or his total offense level, will be a 36. And tax fraud, the final group, I calculate that to be a 32. Now, I'm not going to go into the very complicated grouping rules under the guidelines, but suffice it to say, take my word for it, that the FBAR and the tax fraud cases, those will group together under one group, and they will be, I'm going to call that the FBAR violations. Why? Because the FBAR is greater at 36 under the grouping rules. You're going to merge the lower one into the higher one. But what isn't going to group and what will remain two separate groups are the FBAR violations and the bank fraud. And we're going to see how those work here in a second. So because we have two separate groups, he is going to get a +2, mainly because the FBAR violations are close to the bank fraud. And again, forgive me for going so quickly through this. I detail my reasoning for these calculations in a longer presentation, also available online. So given the grouping, the two groups, plus the large amount of intended loss from the bank, from the fraudulent loans, I score him out at a 41 in criminal history category 1. I'm assuming he's a criminal history category 1. It's a safe bet. That gives him 324 to 405 months under the guidelines, or over 27 years. Now, and here we can see it in the guidelines table. So he's near maxed out on the sentencing table as it is. So certainly 27 years is a lot better than 305 years, but it's still obscenely large. So what is he really going to get? This is where the rubber meets the road, and this is where our company comes in and what we can do with respect to the publicly available Sentencing Commission's database. We now have access to nearly 1 million federal defendants who have been sentenced since 2006. We only go back to 2006 because of the Booker case in 2005, which held that the guidelines are advisory. That created a huge sea change or a paradigm shift, frankly, in sentencing. So data before the Booker case isn't very useful to compare to sentencing trends nowadays. At any rate, looking at those nearly 1 million cases, 18,542 of those cases were just general fraud cases sentenced under 2B1.1, which is, as I've indicated, this is going to be his sentencing guideline. It'll be 2B1.1, which is the general fraud guideline, since his sentence is going to be driven by the loss amount from the fraudulent loans he allegedly obtained. So out of looking at the Commission's data files from 2006 through 2017, we were able to identify 18,542 individuals sentenced under 2B1.1 that were in criminal history 1, 1,665 in the Fourth Circuit, which is the circuit that he's in, and 335 in the Eastern District of Virginia, which is actually the court that he's in, that he'll be sentenced in. And here are the analyses here. 19 months is the average nationwide. The median sentence is 3 months. The Eastern District of Virginia tends to be a little bit more severe in terms of the sentences that it imposes. Up here, a 12-month sentence, or really a 12 months and 1 day, that is in the 58.2nd percentile, meaning It's actually a little on the, it's a little more, 58.2% of all these 18,542 cases, 58.2% received a year and a day or less. That's what this indicates here. And the majority of cases in all geographic locations received a below guideline sentence. So all this is really looking at fraud from a 50,000 foot level, and it would be, it's frankly almost useless to compare what Mr. Manafort is going to receive or what he can expect to receive when looking at this data. But nonetheless, I'm trying to give here just again a 50,000 foot level. The bottom line, what the takeaway from this is most fraud defendants receive less than a year and a day in terms of their sentence. They're not looking at anything close to what Mr. Manafort is looking at. And here we could look at a trend analysis here too. We can see that the median sentences nationwide for everybody sentenced under 2B 1.1 have been rather low. They've grown somewhat over the last few years, but basically median sentences from probation shortly after Booker to just 6 months. But I would not take any comfort in this if I was Mr. Manafort, and especially if I'm looking at a PSR with a final offense level of 41. So what can I do? Well, this is again where we come in and we can really drill down into the data. So what we found was that there were 56 individuals nationwide between 2006 and 2017 that actually were sentenced under 2B 1.1, had a final offense level of 41, and were in criminal history 1 for a guidelines range of 324 to 405 months. So what, and here are the average and median sentences. Certainly a lot more than what the typical or the general population of fraud offenders have received. When we focus in again on those that are similarly situated to Mr. Manafort, he's looking at offense level 41. As we indicated, offense level 41, we get these statistics. So nowhere close, as it turns out, to the guidelines range, but still very significant, and that's really not surprising. If anything is surprising is that it is how low they are relative to the actual guidelines. And just as with the general population, most judges are sentencing below the guidelines range, and significantly so when with respect to those in offense level 41. And generally the reason why has been a pushback against the loss amount. Many judges and many commentators, including myself, have argued that loss really overestimates the harm, and it is not a very good proxy for measuring harm in many cases, especially in Mr. Manafort's case, because as far as the evidence has indicated so far, the banks actually suffered no loss. Now, he did fraudulently obtain these loans, but from what I understand so far, at least, is that those loans were paid back, or he does have the assets to liquidate to pay those loans back. So potentially the banks aren't going to suffer any actual harm. Okay, so let's move on here. Here is a trend analysis. It's not too meaningful, mainly because there's only 56 defendants in this group, meaning there's about on average 5 defendants for each year. It starts at 2007 because there were no similarly situated offenders in 2006. So we can see here what the trend has been. It's been rather erratic, but this is not unexpected when you're looking at such a small universe of sentences. Nonetheless, back in the latest statistics show, roughly what the overall statistics show is that 168 months is the median sentence for those similarly situated. So what we also do, though, is provide a better picture for courts and counsel on what we call sentencing distribution. So just looking at a number like the median here, the median or the average really doesn't give you an accurate flavor of where actual sentences are. How close are most of the sentences to the average or the median? Are they packed closely around there, or are they widely disparate, for lack of a better term? Are they dispersed along a large continuum? Where do the sentences lie? Just again, looking at a single number isn't going to tell you that. But doing a box and whiskers chart, as we do, and some of you may recognize this if you trade stock, this type of chart, this gives a much more meaningful representation graphically of sentence distribution. So here we've looked again at all those same 56 sentenced under 2B 1.1, final offense level 41, and criminal history category 1. And by the way, of those 56, 32 of these are trials. And that shouldn't be surprising because the risk or the likelihood of getting a long sentence, whether you plead guilty or go to trial, is pretty much equally likely, or almost a foregone conclusion. Let me put it that way. So many defendants, when they're looking at a high loss white collar case where there's a lot of fraud involved, opt to go to trial. One, these defendants tend to have means to pay for counsel and pay for a very robust defense, and two, they have a lot on the line. So going back to my original query, why is Manafort doing this? He may just be rolling the dice and either hoping the judge makes a mistake at sentencing, or the government does, or perhaps an acquittal, as unlikely as that may be. So 32 of these 56 cases were the result of trials, and 30 included downward variances. And that's a good indicator for Mr. Manafort, that the majority of those similarly situated to him received a downward variance. And I'm going to emphasize this, that does not include 5Ks. These are true 3553 downward variances. So what this chart shows is, here's the max. So the maximum sentence imposed for similarly situated offenders was actually the bottom of the guideline range. And the lowest sentence was probation. Most likely this individual, or there may have been a couple of individuals, received probation as a result of cooperation, maybe a 5K or something like that. Half of the individuals received between 240 months or 20 years and just over 5.5 years, 66.3 months. This is the third quartile, first quartile. This line here is the median, which, if you will, another way of saying it's the second quartile, the median sentence, meaning half of the 56 received greater than 168 months and half received below, with the average almost equal to the median of 165.5 months, at least as calculated by Excel. So he is looking at a sentence somewhere within this box. It is wide, it's a big box, but it's nonetheless a lot less than the guidelines range, and certainly nowhere close to the statutory maximum. Still a significant sentence. So in the closing minutes here, what could he do to try to mitigate the sentence, to try to argue for a sentence at the lower end of the box here? Well, one of the things is his age, and that's perhaps his best argument, absent any other publicly available information that may mitigate. He's currently 69.3 months, so according to the Social Security life expectancy calculator, he has 15.8 years left. Now, what's really interesting is a recent study by Professor Evelyn Patterson noted that for each year served in prison, a person could expect to lose 2 years of life expectancy, and this actually was cited favorably by the Second Circuit in a case called United States versus Jenkins, where the Second Circuit actually reversed and remanded a sentence that had been imposed within the guidelines. And part of the reason was that the court hadn't taken into account the deleterious effect of long-term incarceration on the life expectancy of the defendant. So let's go ahead and take Dr. Patterson's, or Professor Patterson's analysis here and apply it to Mr. Manafort. And this may be overly simplistic, but for lack of any better analysis here, this is essentially what it looks like. We know that Mr. Manafort is now 69.3 in 2018, and his life expectancy is 85.2 years, as we just indicated. And let's assume furthermore that he gets a 10-year sentence. So if we follow, here's his age, it increases 1 year for every year. So at the end of 10 years, of course, he'll be 79.3 years. But here's his life expectancy, and as Professor Patterson indicated, it's going to decrease by 2 years every year. And what we see is his life expectancy and his age are going to intersect at about the 5-year point. And in other words, when he's about 75 years old, that's it. So if he gets essentially anything more than a 5 years or more, a sentence of 5 years or more is a de facto life sentence for Mr. Manafort, at least statistically speaking. So his one argument could be that a sentence of greater than 5 years is more than necessary for Mr. Manafort, because it's going to be a de facto life sentence. Whether it's 5 years or 50 years or 500 years, it's the same for him. He will die in prison. So again, that's an argument for a lower sentence to give him some hope of getting out one day. But also there's a financial consideration too that can be argued, and that's the cost to the Bureau of Prisons. The over 50 inmate population has increased quite significantly over the last few years, because here in the United States we incarcerate more people than any other country on earth, both in absolute numbers and per capita, and we also incarcerate them for a longer period of time, which results in an aging prison population. This in turn has created resulted in 2 reports from the Office of Inspector General regarding problems with the Bureau of Prison in both managing the medical staffing and just having enough staff to handle general inmate medical issues, as well as problems with the aging population too, which results in increased costs. In fact, even just today, August 1, 2018, NPR had this interesting article about the costs of elderly inmates in prisons, and they were looking at a state prison where elderly inmates are costing close to $250,000 a year to handle in prison. This obviously is going to be Mr. Manafort, or likely could be him, if he's incarcerated for any extended period of time. So with that said, I'll close. Hopefully you found the presentation interesting. My professional estimate, if you will, of where Mr. Manafort is looking is likely around the 10-year mark. While that is not nearly as significant of a sentence as probably most people would think would be just under the circumstances, certainly it is a rational sentence, greater than his life expectancy nonetheless, but one that would not necessarily create unwarranted sentencing disparity looking at the statistics. Certainly a sentence anywhere close to the guidelines range actually would create unwarranted sentencing disparity. Thank you.